three main things. Firstly, what is leadership? How do we understand? What does media framing mean, and how does it relate to leadership? And finally, the impact on women leaders or on gender diversity in the Australian context. Now, there's a popular saying quite often used to emphasize gender equality in debates that women hold up half the sky. And what it alludes to is that women are half the population. In fact, in many countries, women are more than half the population. And as we saw from Mary's presentation, that women are not half the workforce and most definitely not half the leadership. And that rings quite true of Australia as well, where we've only had one female prime minister so far. But the Workforce Gender Equality Agency that tracks and monitors progress of gender representation in organizations puts forth a relatively more positive picture, suggesting that entry-level positions now have gender parity at 50%, and that middle management has at least one-third female representation. The 17% of top leadership position refers collectively to all executive leadership roles, such as chair positions or directorships. But if we were to drill this down, there are currently only 5% female CEOs in the ASX 200. That's 10 women out of 200 CEOs. And for those of us who've been following the news, in 2020, of the 25 CEOs that were appointed, there was only one female appointee. So there is a significant and persistent gap between middle management and those top leadership positions. And I wanted to explore why. Some academics and researchers suggest that media is part of the problem. Media is a strong influencer of public opinion and shapes social reality and how we think about things, including our perceptions and views about men and women in leadership positions. For example, media portrayals will often focus on women's personal characteristics, their family relationships, or their social roles as opposed to their leadership. This suggests that media framing is an important element to consider when we have those debates on why there is a lack of gender diversity in leadership, particularly in the Australian context. But when I say media framing, what I'm essentially referring to is how the visual and discursive elements come together to convey a particular meaning. And as these images will demonstrate, that men and women are portrayed quite differently. As we also heard in the previous presentation, there are social roles, norms, and cultural expectations associated with both men and women. But for women, it makes leadership problematic. For example, men are thought to be strong, competitive, athletic breadwinners, whereas women are described with characteristics such as being compassionate, nurturing, or more suited for domestic life. And media framing reinforces these cultural expectations or social norms. As we see in these top two images, the framing suggests that just because a woman is successful, there is a reason for her to be hated. Don't hate her because she's successful. Whereas a CEO can take on the FBI and still receive positive portrayal when it comes to how it's constructed. By reinforcing these social roles and cultural expectations associated with both genders, women are basically, leadership is problematized for women because they are seen as incompatible with what is expected of leaders or what is expected from leadership. So what is it about leadership that makes women so inappropriate for the role? And to approach that, I took a critical lens to it. Now, traditional approaches to leadership define it as individual traits, personality types, attributes that are possessed by an individual. These have emerged from studying the experiences of successful leaders of the past who have traditionally been, and as a result, those characteristics are masculine or reflective of masculinities. For example, being confident, dominant, competitive, aggressive, authoritative, or being fighters. In the literature, this is often referred to as heroic leadership. However, with time, contemporary approaches have called for more inclusivity, collaboration, or a sharing of power when it comes to leadership. And critical leadership studies redefines leadership not as individual traits possessed by leaders, rather behaviors and characteristics that they exhibit or perform while as leaders. For example, being collaborative or showing empathy, being flexible. As I indicated in the previous slide, these characteristics are associated with women generally, so they are reflective of femininities. And in the literature, this is referred to as post-heroic leadership, which anyone can perform. Uh, but this should have implications for women into leadership positions. Does this create more space for women to now enter into leadership because post-heroic leadership is associated with femininities? And does media framing reflect that? Currently, there is a lack of empirical research in this area. However, a cursory glance at media framing internationally suggests that men are able to perform post-heroic leadership effectively, using empathy and collaboration to reach financial success. Whereas a powerful woman's display of emotion at work is still portrayed with negative connotations, as we can see in these two images on this screen. So, inspired by such framing, my research question was, how does Australian business media frame leaders in leadership? And in particular, what are the implications for women leaders, particularly in response to the call that there should be more inclusive and collaborative leadership? I used a qualitative approach to answer this research question using a discourse and semiotic analysis to analyze business media supplements. The Deal and Boss magazine, essentially. The Deal is a monthly magazine supplement. It's a business supplement for the Australian newspaper, which is produced by News Corp. And Boss magazine is the monthly supplement for Australian Financial Review, which is produced by Fairfax Media. So, taking into account the two leading media production houses of Australia, the visual and discursive elements on the front cover is the editor letter, which is the introduction to the magazine, and the contents, which included all the articles and the headlines, were analyzed to understand how these media artifacts were constructing leadership and leaders against the heroic, post-heroic framework. My findings were quite complex and revealed an array of things that I've tried to demonstrate here on this slide. But essentially, Australian business media constructs leadership as a highly masculine domain where traditional and heroic leadership is dominant. However, post-heroic or those contemporary forms of leadership were also starting to emerge. But the stark differences were in how media framed individual men and women leaders as performing these various forms of leadership. Men were natural inhabitants of that masculine leadership domain, where their individual successes, their triumphs were celebrated and glorified, and they were actually positioned or portrayed as heroes and champions. There were instances where heroic leadership was questioned, particularly in response to contextual factors such as the Royal Commission on Banking and Aged Care, or just a loss of public confidence in these institutions. But even in those situations where the leader was a male leader, media framed it as whether heroic leadership was still appropriate, whether a single leader was even needed, but the male leader was positioned as a potential savior who could still perhaps take the organization through this tough time and triumph in the end. Younger millennial leaders, as the media supplements label them, this unique position where they were part of the changing business landscape, disruptive industries, where they demonstrated collaboration and flexibility in their leadership, but were described through masculine descriptors such as being ambitious or being fighters. But men within the Australian business media were also shown as or portrayed as performing collaborative or inclusive leadership, where they perform femininities in their leadership. However, what's interesting is in acknowledging their move from traditional to contemporary styles of leadership, the media position them as courageous or valiant for doing that, almost calling them post-heroic heroes for forming feminine leadership or femininities in leadership. Different to how women were portrayed in the business media. Since leadership was constructed or created as a masculine domain, women were outsiders, but they were accepted as credible or legitimate leaders if they were able to mirror those masculinities. For example, leading with authority or taking risks. But interestingly, being able to mirror masculinities hinged on that caveat that they also conform to gender norms or femininities in gender norms, in, for example, how they appeared, their appearance, their attire, how they demonstrated their social roles. In situations where those contextual influences made heroic leadership the question when it was a male leader, when the subject of the framing was a woman, the framing positioned it as if she was incapable of mirroring masculinities or performing traditional leadership effectively, rather than question whether heroic leadership is needed at all. And in the data that was analyzed, women were not actually seen in the post-heroic leadership space. The literature suggests that it is perhaps because performing femininities in gender cancels out also performing femininities in leadership, and any advantage that post-heroic leadership would have afforded to such to women, or their progression into leadership roles, basically became null in this situation. Collectively, these findings provide some rich insights into how the Australian business media views leadership, and why men and women are positioned as such, or why women are not actually progressing into those top leadership roles. There are some theoretical insights that I gained from this research about understanding how heroic and traditional leadership is dominant and what the nuances and complexities are, but also that within the Australian context, post-heroic leadership has been recognized, but it is still framed or referred to with the same heroic rhetoric, almost subsuming it within those dominant masculine, hegemonic masculine ways of thinking about leadership. Women so far are excluded from this space and are not seen, at least in the data that was analyzed so far. And there are quite significant implications for organizations who take cue from media to understand or develop their own perceptions of leadership, leadership roles and structures, and particularly for individual men and women who are aspiring for those roles. You cannot be what you cannot see. And if you do not see enough women in those roles, it will have an impact on how you perform your own roles as well. Now, this was a preliminary study, and it requires insights from additional stakeholders, such as media producers or audiences, even leaders themselves, to develop these themes further. But hopefully, this has been able to highlight the important role that media framing plays in contributing to the debate on the lack of gender diversity in leadership. And that brings me to a conclusion on my presentation. If there are any questions, I'd be more than happy to take them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. And as Maria's mentioned, she's happy to take questions, and we've got a wee bit of time for that if you have any. And otherwise, we can, of course, continue the discussion during the final session at around about 2:10. Well, I'm not seeing any hands up.
We've got
ruthlessly.
Yep, we've got we'll go Patricia and then Glenda.
Oh my goodness.
Patricia.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Maria. That was fascinating. That's so interesting and slightly alarming as well. And I guess particularly what you presented just in that final slide, looking at the femininities conundrum, that was a little bit depressing to think, oh, just where this group of people might have their advantage